The storm arrived without warning that autumn evening, sweeping through the valley with sheets of cold rain that turned cobblestone streets into rivers. Most sensible folk had retreated to their homes hours ago, bolting shutters and stoking fires against the chill. The village at the foot of the mountain had grown quiet, save for the relentless drumming of water against rooftops and the occasional groan of wind through narrow alleyways. But not everyone had a home to retreat to. Melina pressed her daughter closer to her chest, feeling the small body shiver against her own. 5-year-old Rosie had stopped crying an hour ago, not because she felt better, but because she was too exhausted to continue. Her tiny fingers clutched the fabric of her mother's black coat, holding on with the desperate grip of a child who understood, even at her young age, that the world had become uncertain and frightening. Just a little further, and Melina whispered, though she had no destination in mind. She had been saying those words for 3 villages now, through 2 weeks of walking, of sleeping in barns when farmers were kind enough to look the other way, of accepting scraps of bread from strangers who pitied the dark-haired woman and her pale daughter but couldn't afford to offer more. The rain plastered Melina's long black hair against her face, and her worn boots squelched with every step. She had always dressed in dark clothing. It was simply who she was, how she had always been since her teenage years in the city. The heavy silver jewelry, the dark kohl around her eyes, the layers of black lace and leather that had once made her feel powerful and distinct. Now those same clothes hung heavy with water, offering no protection against the cold that seeped into her bones. She turned down another street, hoping to find an overhang or an unlocked stable. Anything to get Rosie out of the rain. The child had developed a cough 2 days ago, and Melina could feel the heat radiating from her small forehead. Fever. A mother's worst fear when medicine was a luxury she couldn't afford, and doctors turned away those without coin. The road began to climb, and Melina realized with growing dread that she had wandered beyond the village proper. The houses grew sparse, then vanished entirely, replaced by ancient trees that bent in the wind like mourners at a funeral. She should turn back. She knew she should turn back. But her legs carried her forward as if guided by something beyond her own will, and soon she found herself standing before a gate she had not seen from the village below. The manor rose from the mountainside like a creature of shadow and stone, its towers reaching toward the churning clouds. It was old, impossibly old, with architecture that spoke of centuries rather than generations. Most of the windows were dark, but here and there, a faint golden glow suggested life within. Or something like life. Melina had heard the stories. Everyone in this region had. The Lord of the Mountain, they called him. The one who never aged, who never appeared in daylight, who had ruled these lands since before anyone's grandparents were born. The Vampire King. She should have felt fear. Perhaps, once, she would have. But fear was a luxury reserved for those who had something left to lose. Mamar, Rosie murmured weakly, her voice barely audible above the storm. I'm cold. Melina looked at the gate, then at her daughter's face, pale as moonlight and just as fragile. She had tried every door in 3 villages. She had begged at churches and pleaded at inns. She had swallowed every ounce of pride she possessed and asked for help from people who looked at her dark clothes and darker demeanor and saw only someone to be feared or shunned. Perhaps, she thought bitterly, a monster would be kinder than the so-called decent folk. She pushed open the gate. Victor had been reading when he felt them. It was not a sound that alerted him, nor a sight. It was something older, something woven into the very fabric of what he had become 300 years ago when death had claimed his mortal life and left him with this peculiar existence. He could sense heartbeats like distant drums, could feel the warmth of living blood like a candle flame in a dark room. Two flames approached. One steady but exhausted. One flickering, fighting to stay lit. He set down his book, a philosophical treatise from a country that no longer existed, and moved to the window of his study. The rain obscured much, but his eyes had long ago adapted to pierce through ordinary darkness. He saw them on the path below, a woman in black, walking with the determined stride of someone who had passed beyond exhaustion into something harder. In her arms, a child. Victor felt nothing. Or so he told himself. He had spent centuries cultivating the absence of feeling, wrapping himself in solitude like armor. Emotions were for the living. He was something else now, something that existed outside the warm circle of humanity. He fed when necessary, slept when the sun demanded it, and otherwise passed his endless years in the quiet pursuit of knowledge and the occasional management of the lands that technically fell under his dominion. He did not involve himself with mortals. He did not invite them into his home. He did not concern himself with their brief, flickering lives. The woman reached his front door. Through the stone and wood, he heard her hesitate. He heard the child's labored breathing, the wet rattle that spoke of illness taking hold in small lungs. Victor turned away from the window. He had lived for 3 centuries. He had watched empires rise and fall, had seen plagues sweep through villages like scythes through wheat. He had learned long ago that attachment brought only pain, that caring for mortals was an exercise in inevitable grief. The woman knocked. The sound was not loud. It was not demanding. It was the knock of someone who expected nothing but could not help but try anyway. It was the knock of a mother with no options left, making one final attempt before surrendering to whatever fate awaited her and her child in the cold. Victor stood very still. The child coughed. Even through the heavy door, he heard it, that terrible, wet sound that spoke of fever and fluid and the fragile thread by which young lives hung. He crossed to the door. Melina did not know what she expected when the door opened. A monster, perhaps. Fangs and red eyes and the cold cruelty of a creature that fared on human blood. She had braced herself for rejection at best, something worse at worst. What she found was a tall man with silver-touched dark hair, wearing a simple linen shirt and dark trousers. His face was pale, yes, but not unnaturally so. His eyes were grey, like winter sky, and held something she could not immediately name. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze dropped to the child in her arms. "She's ill," he said. It was not a question. Melina nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. The man, the vampire, the monster, the lord of the mountain, stepped aside. "Come in." She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then she crossed the threshold, carrying her daughter into the home of a creature she had been taught to fear since childhood. The warmth hit her immediately, a gentle heat that seemed to seep into her waterlogged clothes and frozen bones. The entrance hall was large but not ostentatious, decorated with old tapestries and warm wooden furniture that spoke of comfort rather than intimidation. Candles burned in wall sconces, casting a golden glow that softened every shadow. "This way," the man said, already moving toward a hallway. "There's a fire in the east parlor. You'll be warm there." Melina followed, too grateful and too stunned to question. She had been prepared to beg. She had been prepared to bargain, to offer whatever meager skills she possessed in exchange for shelter. She had not been prepared for this quiet, immediate acceptance. The parlor was warm and welcoming, with thick carpets underfoot and a substantial fire crackling in a stone hearth. The man gestured to a settee near the flames. "Sit. I'll bring blankets and something warm for the child to drink." "Wait," Melina managed, her voice hoarse from cold and disuse. "Why? Why are you helping us?" He paused at the doorway and turned to look at her. For a long moment, he did not answer. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "Because you knocked," he said. "And because I could." Then he was gone, leaving Melina standing in the warm room with her sick daughter and more questions than she could count. The first 3 days passed in a blur of fever and fear. Victor had seen illness before, of course. He had witnessed the great plagues, had watched mortals succumb to diseases that modern medicine would one day render harmless. He knew that the child's fever was serious but not necessarily fatal, if treated properly, if kept warm and hydrated, if given time and care. He sent for the village healer, a practical woman named Agnes who had served his lands for 40 years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. She came with her bag of herbs and tinctures, examined the child with gentle, competent hands, and prescribed rest, warmth, and a series of bitter teas that the little girl accepted with admirable stoicism. "She'll recover," Agnes told Melina, patting her hand with rough kindness. "Children are resilient. Keep her warm and make sure she drinks, and she'll be running about within the week." The relief that flooded Melina's face was so profound that Victor had to look away. He had forgotten how deeply mortals felt, how every emotion played across their features like music across strings. He retreated to his study and tried to return to his reading. But his ears, sharper than any mortal's, kept catching sounds from the east parlor. The child's small voice, still weak but growing stronger. The mother's low responses, steady and comforting. The crackle of the fire. The whisper of blankets being adjusted. He found himself listening more than reading. On the 4th day, the child's fever broke. Victor was in his study when he heard the change, the steadying of that small heartbeat, the easing of labored breath into something deeper and more restful. True sleep, finally. Healing sleep. An hour later, there was a soft knock at his study door. "Enter," he said, closing his book. Melina stepped inside. She had washed and changed. He had left simple clothes in the wardrobe of the guest chamber, knowing her own garments were ruined beyond repair. She still wore black, because black was what he had, but she looked less like a drowned spectre now. Her dark hair was dry and brushed back from a face that, while still tired, had lost its desperate edge. "Rosie's sleeping," she said. Really sleeping, not just out drifting. Victor nodded. Agnes said she would recover. She did. Melina hesitated, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure whether to advance or retreat. "I wanted to thank you. Properly. For everything you've done." "There is no need." "There is." Her voice was firm now, some of that steel he had sensed in her returning. "You didn't have to open your door. You didn't have to call the healer or give us a room or any of it. You could have turned us away, and no one would have blamed you." "I would have blamed me," Victor said quietly. "There are some things one cannot do and remain, or oneself." Melina studied him with those dark eyes, and Victor found himself oddly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. She was not afraid of him. That was unusual. Most mortals, even those who had never met him, carried an instinctive wariness in his presence. This woman looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "The stories say you're a monster," she said finally. "They say you drink blood and prey on the innocent." "I drink blood," Victor admitted. "When I must. It is the nature of what I am. But I have not taken a life for sustenance in over a century. There are other ways. Animal blood suffices, if one is not particular about taste." "And preying on the innocent?" Victor's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "I find the innocent considerably more trouble than they're worth. They ask questions. They require explanations. They have an unfortunate tendency to develop gratitude." Melina's expression shifted, and for a moment, Victor thought he saw the ghost of a smile on her own face. It transformed her, that smile. Made her look younger, softer. "I should let you return to your reading," she said. "But I meant what I said. Thank you." She left, and Victor sat for a long time in the quiet of his study, wondering why her thanks had felt like a gift. Rosie recovered with the remarkable speed of children everywhere. Within a week, she was sitting up and demanding stories. Within 2 weeks, she was exploring the manor with the fearless curiosity of a 5-year-old who had not yet learned that some doors should remain closed. Victor discovered her in his library one afternoon, standing on tiptoe to reach a book on the lowest shelf. She was humming tunelessly to herself, apparently unbothered by the ancient tomes and strange artifacts that surrounded her. "That one is in Latin," he said, and she spun around with a gasp. I can't read Latin, Ishi said, recovering quickly. I can't read anything yet. Mumar was going to teach me, but then we had to leave our house. Victor crossed to the shelf and knelt to her level. Why did you have to leave your house? Rose's small face grew serious. The bad men came. They said Mumar owed them money because of Pupper's debts. But Pupper went away before I was born, so Mumar said that wasn't fair. They said they would take our house if she didn't pay, and then they did. Victor felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger. He had long ago learned to master anger, but something harder, something that took note and filed away details for later consideration. Where are these bad men now? Back in the city. That's why we had to walk so far. Mama said they wouldn't follow us all the way here. Rosie tilted her head. Are you a vampire? The shift in topic was so abrupt that Victor nearly laughed. Yes. Do you turn into a bat? No. Do you sleep in a coffin? I have a perfectly comfortable bed, thank you. Do you sparkle in the sunlight? Victor's expression conveyed profound offense. Absolutely not. Where did you hear such nonsense? Rosie giggled, and the sound was so unexpected and so bright that Victor found himself momentarily disarmed. When had he last heard a child laugh? He could not remember. You're funny, Ishi declared. I thought vampires would be scary, but you're not scary at all. I assure you, I'm extremely frightening. No, you're not. She reached up and patted his hand with her small fingers. You're nice. You let Mamar and me stay in your house, and you called the doctor for me, and you gave me soup when I was sick. Nice people aren't scary. Victor looked down at the small hand resting on his, at the absolute trust in those young eyes, and felt something shift inside him. Something that had been still and cold for a very long time began, ever so slowly, to warm. Winter settled over the mountain, and Victor found his household transformed in ways he had not anticipated. He had expected his guests to leave once Rosie was well. He had prepared himself for their departure, had even begun to convince himself that their absence would be a relief. But days turned to weeks, and neither Melina nor Rosie showed any inclination to venture back into a world that had treated them so poorly. Victor told himself he was simply being practical. The mountain passes were treacherous in winter. It would be irresponsible to send a woman and child out into the snow. He told himself he was merely being a good host, that his lands required a lord who showed hospitality to those in need. He did not tell himself that he had grown accustomed to the sound of Rose's footsteps echoing through halls that had known only silence for decades. He did not acknowledge that he looked forward to his evening conversations with Melina, discussions that ranged from philosophy to music to the curious customs of mortals in various ages. He certainly did not admit that the manor felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home with each passing day. But these things were true nonetheless. Melina began to take on small responsibilities around the manor, not because Victor asked, but because she was not the kind of woman who could sit idle. She organized his library, gently chiding him for his haphazard filing system. She tended the small greenhouse attached to the kitchen, coaxing life from seeds that had lain dormant for years. She mended tapestries and polished silver, and generally made herself indispensable in 100 small ways. "You don't have to work," Victor told her one evening, watching her stitch a tear in an ancient hanging. "You're a guest, not a servant." "I know," she said, not looking up from her needle. "But I'm not good at doing nothing. It makes me feel, purposeless." "You could read." "I have several thousand books that require no mending." She smiled, that rare expression that still caught him off guard. "I'll work my way through them eventually. But for now, this feels right. Contributing something. Being useful." She paused, her hands stilling. "I spent my whole life being told I was too strange, too dark, too different. That I'd never amount to anything. That my choices would lead me nowhere good. And yet here you are. Here I am. In a vampire's house on a mountain, feeling safer than I ever did in the city." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes steady. "You gave us more than shelter, Victor. You gave us peace. I don't know how to repay that." "There is no debt," he said quietly. "You owe me nothing." "Then let me give what I can give freely. My work. My presence. My—" She hesitated, searching for the right word. "My gratitude. Not as payment, but as offering." Victor was silent for a long moment. Then he inclined his head. "Freely given, freely accepted." Spring came slowly to the mountain, but it came. Victor stood at his window one morning and watched Rosie playing in the garden below, chasing butterflies through the early flowers. She had grown in the months since that stormy night. Her cheeks had filled out, pink with health rather than pale with fever. Her laughter rang clear and bright across the grounds. Melina stood nearby, watching her daughter with an expression of quiet contentment. She too had changed. The desperate edge was gone, replaced by something softer but no less strong. She carried herself differently now, not hunched against an uncaring world, but straight-backed and sure. She had found her footing. They both had. Victor thought about the centuries stretching behind him, the endless parade of empty years. He thought about the centuries that still lay ahead, the eternity of existence that had once seemed more burden than gift. He thought about a knock on a door on a rainy night, and a choice made in a moment of unexpected compassion. He did not know what the future held. He did not know how long Melina and Rosie would stay, or what would happen when the world inevitably intruded on their small haven. He could not protect them from everything, not from time, not from age, not from the fundamental fragility of mortal life. But he could protect them from what he could. He could offer shelter and safety and the steady presence of someone who would stand between them and harm. He could give them what he had given them from the first moment, a place in his house, and in whatever remained of his heart. It was not much, perhaps, by the standards of the living. But for one who had thought himself beyond such things, it was everything. Victor turned from the window and went downstairs to join them in the garden. The sun was warm, the flowers were blooming, and somewhere in the distance, a child was laughing. For the first time in 300 years, he felt like he might be home. That evening, as the three of them sat together in the parlour, Rosie drowsing against her mother's side, Melina reading aloud from a book of fairy tales, Victor listening with more attention than he would ever admit, the fire crackled warmly and the shadows held no menace. "This one's about a princess and a dragon," Melina said, turning the page. "But the dragon isn't the villain." "What is it, then?" Rosie murmured sleepily. "The guardian. It protects the princess from all the people who want to hurt her." Rosie smiled without opening her eyes. "Like Victor protects us?" Melina looked up from the book, meeting Victor's gaze across the room. Something passed between them, not romance, not the feverish passion of stories, but something quieter and perhaps more lasting. Understanding. Trust. The recognition of two souls who had found unexpected harbour in each other's company. "Yes," Melina said softly. "Like Victor protects us." Victor said nothing. But he inclined his head slightly, accepting the comparison, accepting the role he had never sought but could not now imagine relinquishing. Outside, the night was deep and dark. But inside the manor on the mountain, there was warmth and safety and the simple, profound miracle of people who had chosen to stay. And that, in the end, was enough.